The future is here. I've been giving, really for the last year and a half, coming up on 2 years, a presentation or a speech called The End of the Era of the Single Store Generalist Body Shop, which is a mouthful, but I had to be specific here because it sounds scary. It sounds negative.
Yes.
And certainly in collision repair, we are not going to be all things to all people. You are not going to make a great living as one store fixing every car coming in the future of collision repair.
All right, we're back with another episode of the Source Code Sessions. Today we've got Cole Strandberg from Focus Investment Banking, and we're really here today to talk all things collision. And I think, our goal here on the show is to always have unique perspectives. And I think Cole has a really unique perspective on the market because he's spent time both in an organization as an operator growing a business, as well as helping dozens of other owners transact and find the right partner for their business's next chapter. So on that note, Cole, maybe I could pass it off to you.
Awesome, man. Really appreciate that introduction. I have automotive in my blood. Grew up around a family business in the collision repair ecosystem, an equipment distribution business to be exact. So grew up kind of idolizing entrepreneurs and these shop owners who were growing and scaling and operating really, really cool businesses. Out of school, ended up going into investment banking in more of a traditional little cog, big machine, generalist capacity. And a couple years into that, the family business came calling and they were getting some acquisition interest at the time. And I felt, selflessly, I think I could be of some help here given my background, and B, selfishly, being on the sidelines and involved from an intermediary perspective on transactions. I thought it'd be really cool to be in the operator's seat and be in the seller's seat. And it was, and ended up being a longer road, I think, to that acquisition than anticipated. Ended up spending about 6 years in total with the family business, 3 of which under my family's ownership, 3 of which with the private equity group we ultimately would partner with as a platform. Made a bunch of acquisitions, kind of rolled up the Southeast into the Mid-Atlantic in that space with some brands that anybody familiar with collision repair would be very, very familiar with. And at some point during that time, developed a real passion for the industry, kind of by accident. But the people are just amazing, salt of the earth, entrepreneurially minded. And once you get the hooks of automotive in you, there's no escaping. But at the same time, I missed the deal side of the business. So ended up joining where I am today, Focus Investment Banking, where I spend 100% of my time in the automotive aftermarket with a definite flair toward collision repair specifically. And what we do at Focus, specifically on our automotive aftermarket team, we specialize in sell-side M&A advisory and capital raising for some incredible businesses in the space.
No, I appreciate that. And I think it's great to get your perspective. Collision's been consolidated for a long time, or there's been consolidators, but there's also an endless stream of technicians or mechanics or people that look at it and say, hey, I want to go out on my own. I'm going to start the next shop. I'm going to start, the next Gerber collision. And so you have this kind of constant recycled entrepreneurialism that is always present, and it always creates the next rising star within the industry.
It's so true, man. And for all that we talk across trades, but specifically in collision repair, about the talent shortage and the recruiting efforts, such a cool component of recruiting young and new and motivated talent is the countless success stories of people starting in that technician role and growing into entrepreneurs and CEOs of some massive, massive companies. I think the premier example of that in collision repair today is Matt Ebert, who is a absolute ground up, built an empire, partnered with private equity, and is now one of certainly the top 5 collision repairs across the country. And to speak with leaders like that, you get the sense, hey, all right, hey, they're brilliant. There's something unique about them. But at the same time, from the humble beginnings and starting from the bottom, it really inspires a lot of confidence, I guess, opportunity that, hey, this is an industry where if you're something, you can really build something special and incredible. And so many stories of that happening at different levels today.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating point because I think one of the things that I find really interesting in these types of businesses, we're very active in auto and collision as well. But one of the things that I've seen that makes people the most successful is how much they're willing to dedicate to the training and development and education of their team. And oftentimes that goes beyond just how you fix the car, but how do you start to take more kind of responsibility in the role of the business of fixing cars? And I think, when you give that to prospective new people, new technicians in the field, it's exciting because there is a pretty clear path to going from, starting, in the most kind of low parts of the organization to really either growing within those organizations, running your own organization or whatever that looks like.
100%, man. And what a great foundation of knowledge to understand whatever side of the business it is from a really intimate level to where you'll never be fooled by a technician telling you something as an owner.
Yeah.
Whereas, certainly your generic kind of private equity guy coming into the business and going the search route, maybe for example, it's going to take a lot to learn the mechanics behind the
Mhm.
business. To start at that level and to know your ceiling is just limitless is really a cool position to be able to market as an industry.
Yeah, and I think it's always good to be able when this is a boots on the ground business, right? The distance between middle management, store management, and the technicians is very small. Oftentimes, it's a window, and being able to speak to that in a way where you're able to engage and communicate in a way that the people actually fixing the cars, and then the people that are maybe more focused on the business of fixing cars are able to understand. And so I think to start, what I'd love to just hear is there's a lot of, it's a very attractive industry right now, collision. That's across the strategics, private equity firms that have platforms, the independent sponsors and search funds that want to get in. Maybe you could just talk about how all the different buyers are kind of playing in the ecosystem and what you're seeing and maybe how that's changed recently.
It's constantly evolving, which is really cool. And when I speak to operators with, excuse me, within the industry, I reiterate, hey, so much activity in the M&A markets is really a positive because you're having so many different buyers out there with varying levels of sophistication, but most of whom are really, really smart people. And so if you're like me, who, hey, we kind of wandered into the collision repair industry out of chance or out of family. Now like, all right, hey, there's something there when you have a bunch of brilliant, brilliant people kind of clamoring over deals to get into the space. From a buyer pool, we look at it at a few different tranches. The first one is certainly the national consolidators. Historically, that's been a big five. However, with some recent transactions, that's turning into a big four here in the very near term. These are all either publicly traded in the case of the Boyd Group, likely soon to be Caliber Collision as well, or backed by some of the biggest private equity groups in the country. The next tranche is this boom of private equity backed regional platforms around the country, all with a slightly different approach to how they're building a business. You have groups that are focused on highline OEM certifications. You have groups that are focused on hyper density within a given market and a traditional DRP approach. You have groups that are backed by family offices with an evergreen approach to their holding time. And then you got the traditional private equity approach as well with, hey, we're going to have that 3, 5, 7 year hold period. We're going to put the pedal down until that music stops. Beneath that or coinciding with that is private equity looking for their platform. Something that I think really speaks to the quality and the recession resiliency of this industry is I spoke last year with over 100 private equity groups, not in the collision repair industry, but looking to be in the collision repair industry. Fortunately for folks in the industry, unfortunately for my calendar, I'm tracking to beat that this year for some of the headwinds that are very public in our industry today with claims volume, insurance challenges. Really smart money remains very, very compelled by the collision repair industry. And these guys all have different requirements, but typically we're talking north of 2 million of EBITDA at a minimum. Multiple locations is kind of viewed as that platform, albeit you have some groups out there that'll go a fair bit lower than that because they have an operating partner that they're kind of starting with rather than acquiring that CEO and that platform. They're starting with a CEO and going from there, giving them some more flexibility. Beneath that, you have a number of independent sponsors, search funds as well that are really out there in the market looking, though historically they've had a hard time meeting valuation expectations as it compares to some of these national consolidators, but those dynamics are evolving pretty quickly.
I think the opportunity for the new investors to get in the space is always going to be if there's a perfect asset, you're not probably not going to compete with the existing buyers that have a lot of advantages in terms of what they can pay. You're going to always have to be flexible in looking for things that maybe are a little more off the beaten path. It's an owner that, is really interested in growing with you and believes that your skill set combined with theirs, they can turn into an MSO where they get a much larger kind of second bite of the apple. Maybe it's, they have, 3 collisions and 1 repair and you have to sell off the repair or whatever it is. But I agree. It's hard for new buyers to compete with both the strategics and then the existing PE firms and then the PE firms that want to get in unless they have some kind of edge in the industry or the
Yep.
deal has a little bit of hair on it.
Exactly right. And there's good news here. But the key, I think, highlight from what you pointed out here is the superpower for small private equity groups, independent sponsors, searchers, is the ability to be a little bit flexible and the ability to be a little bit creative. And the good news is at the high levels, we're seeing valuations from the consolidators slowly dipping. I mean, we're on a bit of a downward trajectory, whether that's cyclical, macro remains to be seen. It hasn't been a case of the valuations falling through the floor by any stretch, but we are seeing a slight decline compared to, call it 2023 and 2024 valuations. So from a fundamental perspective, the gap between independent sponsor or private equity valuations and how consolidators value the business is shrinking. And to give a quick little plug on how that typically is viewed, consolidators, of course, everyone's ultimately backing into an EBITDA calculation, but consolidators, when they're out there approaching business development and M&A in the market, they're initially at least speaking of valuations in terms of a percentage of sales. And so in 2023, 2024, we started seeing that ceiling hit 120% of sales or so, given industry standard margins at 12x or so EBITDA multiple. So really, really tough fundamentally for folks to compete. As those percentage of sales-based valuations are decreasing, we're decreasing the gap between valuations and what people can pay.
And I think if you are a sponsor looking to get into the space, one of the best ways that you can convince an operator is by having a strategy and ideally a pipeline of potential acquisitions where you can give them line of sight to creating value very quickly.
Percent. Yeah, those M&A chops are often something that smaller operators don't have. The ability to navigate equity markets, debt markets, the ability to have those conversations about M&A. And that's something you can definitely bring. Another great tailwind for acquirers looking to get into the collision repair space. Really tough to find that perfect fit. Cinderella's glass slipper of a great business and a great operator without getting massive competition and some crazy valuations. The great thing is the talent pool from an executive level in this industry is really mature to the point where you're seeing other kind of
Yes.
adjacent industries in automotive poaching from collision repair. And so among these national consolidators, there's a ton of really, really good executive level, CEO level talent that would be happy to take a look at some of these unique kind of growing MSO opportunities.
Yeah. And so when you're in the shoes of an owner, right, I think, the industry is for those that don't know, still absolutely dominated by single stores. When you look at the kind of the industry outside of the large consolidators, right? So if you are a single store operator and you're looking to sell in the next 12 to 18 months, specifically, let's start maybe operationally. What are the things that acquirers value? How can you best prepare your operations to be able to exit?
So first off, the bigger and more scale you can show, the more confidence buyers have in your operation and the larger that buyer pool is going to be. For today, and this is a snapshot of today, I'm not sure when this is going to air, but DRPs are stingier than they have been in a long time. To have, if that's your strategy, great DRPs in place, to have dealer relationships in place. I think people for many, many years, this was one of the only industries where you didn't hear the term customer concentration. Now that's being more widely talked about with, man, this is too reliant on one DRP or one insurance relationship or one dealership relationship. So some diversity among your revenue. iCar Gold's kind of a base level foundation to make sure you're where you want to be. And this is a really hard one to change, but it's a fact. From a consolidator perspective, 10,000 square feet is sort of the minimum that folks want to see. And so if we're operating too far beneath that, there is certainly some wiggle room, but you want to keep that in mind as well. Technicians are important. If you have an aging technician base, you want to figure out some solutions there. And then for single store owners specifically, having a general manager in place for you to ultimately step aside is going to increase the level of interest in your business as well.
I think what's tough for a lot of single store owners is when you don't hit the square footage threshold that some of the larger acquirers are looking after. One of the things that I think is one of the few solutions there is to look, because when you look at what can overcome these, I don't want to say deficiencies, but these things that, the acquirers want to see, the answer is often scale. They might not want one 7,000 square foot, but if you have four 7,000 square foot locations, there's going to be more interest, right? Because there will be
100%.
more. So I think we'll touch on this more in a second, but I think for those people that don't hit those kind of just, pure real estate thresholds, which is difficult to fix, right? And expensive to fix oftentimes if it means moving. Or so how do you think about scenarios, ways, creative solutions to overcoming the real estate size problem?
Yeah, diversity is the key. I think you hit the nail on the head. If you're looking at exiting and you don't have the runway to scale and hit that, I think your buyer pool sort of shifts to folks who have scaled a little bit, but maybe face similar dynamics to your business. And so you're going to local consolidators and regional consolidators more likely than the national consolidators. Which is perfectly fine. Often there's not a very wide gap between those and the national consolidators. But to scale and to your point, if you have four shops and one or two of them are small, but one or two of them may check the boxes, it becomes a lot less concentration on small stores than 100%. And so scale is always amazing. It's very easy to sit here and say, man, you need to scale. And there's a ton of value in doing that, right? Multiple expansion, multiple arbitrage in your acquisitions. In theory, creating a better lifestyle for you where you're not so hands-on and monitoring one location all the time. But it's a matter of ROI too. There's got to be runway. So I will tell you, options are increasing regardless of what your store looks like, albeit the market is shifting a little bit to single stores very transparently. It's more of a buyer's market than a seller's market today.
Yeah, I think that's we've seen a similar change. And when you think about if you're a single store operator in a market and you want to try and create some scale within that market, is that possible to merge with other buyers? If you do want to go out and try and acquire another single store operator, can you just talk about the structures you're seeing there? What works, what doesn't?
Creativity is the key, and structures can be pretty flexible. Absolutely the opportunity to merge, even if not officially, but going into a process, we often find merger of equal opportunities to go ahead and put two groups or two stores together. And now we're talking either the creation of an MSO opportunity or the expansion of an MSO opportunity, which is very likely to see some multiple expansion and valuation increases. A lot of different ways to go about doing this. There's certainly ways to get finance to actually execute a transaction to go ahead and buy stores. And the good news is that multiple arbitrage comes very much into play. Valuations for single
Not to
stores are,
cut you off yet, could you just kind
yeah,
of talk about, to a single store owner, what does the word multiple arbitrage mean? Why does it exist? And why is it an important consideration as you either look to sell your potential single store or buy another single store?
it's a great stopping point. Thank you for doing that. Multiple arbitrage, very simply, is a math equation that says 1 + 1 = 3. It's putting different groups together that separately have a limited level of value, but together that valuation increases beyond the obvious, right? So take two body shops, for example. They're each doing $3 million in sales, 300K in EBITDA. Together now, it's two stores, 6 million in sales, $6 million in EBITDA. Obviously, that's worth more. The multiple arbitrage means if those stores individually would have sold for, call it a 3x, together they might sell for a 5x. And now both individual businesses have recognized an increase in value just by being together. It's a big part of the magic of this industry. It's a very clear example of why private equity has a ton of interest, among other reasons. And it's why that you look at years past, these multiples that the big organizations would pay. These X's, for example, the reason they can do that is, in the case of Gerber, last I looked, they were trading at 13, 14, 15 times EBITDA, somewhere in there. The minute that acquisition is integrated, that they just bought for X, 10X, whatever it is, it's now worth whatever they're trading at publicly. And that's the value of multiple arbitrage.
And I think in my experience, you basically have two main things that drive that arbitrage here, and that's rooftops and EBITDA. And there's obviously other things as well, but there's a clear threshold once you get above 1 million of EBITDA. There's a clear threshold once you get above 3 or 4 rooftops. And as a business owner, I think it's important to consider how can I be in scenarios where if I am going to sell, I want to kind of maybe find a scenario where I have to work a little longer, but I can be a part of a situation where I'm participating in some of that upside, or do I want to, sell a single store and just walk away?
Absolutely. Big part of the calculus. A lot of it comes down to energy and appetite, right? If there's an appetite for some risk, some level of debt coming in, and or letting an equal size group kind of behind the curtain and kind of generating that very intimate relationship of what a merger of equals could potentially look like.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of a lot of operators have networks of other operators that are in a similar situation. So I do think that just being open about what your goals are with other people within your network, keeping discourse open as opposed to trying to be kind of, sheltered can be beneficial.
100%. And look, this is happening more and more with our deals where we're sort of helping groups create a bigger group to recognize that increase in multiple, but also that increase in the number of potential buyers that are out there, right? If you're a single store with very few exceptions, private equity is not going to be a real player. And if we kind of take into account that 100 or so private equity groups, 100 to 150 that are actively out there pursuing, you leave a lot on the table if you're not having that scale. Your options are really limited to strategics. If you can build that platform for them, you typically reap the rewards. And I want to spend a little bit more time on this exact topic because there are multiple ways to take advantage of adding scale, call it at the finish line with a little bit of runway. The most simple way is to go and buy an extra shop or two. If you have the ability to do that, I like to say there are plenty of reasons not to grow. Access to capital should not be one of those reasons. Between commercial lending, private debt, SBA, there's lots of incentives and opportunities out there for small business owners to go ahead and grow via acquisition.
Especially if other operators trust you as an operator.
This is a big industry, but a small world, and your reputation means a lot. And that certainly greases the wheels on the ability to grow via acquisition if you have that good reputation and you've built those good relationships. The other way to take advantage, there's numerous. There's that merger of equals. There's that merger of less than equals where you can actually go out and get some shops identified to put under LOI and then include them in your transaction where in theory you could take advantage of some of that arbitrage by creating that, even if you've never fully paid for it. And then the last one.
In that scenario, I would say typically you're not going to get recognized for everything, right? Because
typically not. There are certainly exceptions to that rule, but typically there is some value created in doing that.
Exactly.
That allows you. And it allows you to, in that case, to increase your effective multiple. If not full credit, some credit, and that's going to really help with the math there. And then the last thing is not something that will necessarily add to your EBITDA that you're bringing to market, but it will create some excitement, I think, around the opportunity that your opportunity represents. And that's putting together, as a part of your sales process, a list of acquisition targets that are relatively warm for the future owner and steward of your business. And that way they can kind of paint a picture as to, hey, all right, this might be a little bit of a premium, but we have a path toward growth and potentially a path toward decreasing our all-in effective multiple for this group of businesses.
I think another kind of term or idea that's on the very forefront here is just, technology and AI and how that comes into play and how just software at a smaller scale. Because I think one of the things when you are a single store, one of the things that's always important is what's the ease of integrating you into another system. So maybe you could just talk about what you're seeing on the software side, what the market values the most. What if you were starting with a software, basically zero, everything on paper, what would you really want to focus on getting implemented on the 12 months prior to a sale?
Oh man, there's some flexibility there. I can tell you the bulk of the big boys use CCC or Mitchell. CCC is kind of the Kleenex from my perspective, right? The name that most people will just reference from a systems perspective. Beyond just management systems, estimating software, you have a few kind of primary options. You probably don't want to go too much out on a limb on this up and comer software if you're toward the end of your holding period and considering an exit at some point in the near future. You want to stick with primarily those legacy brands. Now, the software piece and the AI piece opens up a whole new can of worms here where it becomes an ROI calculation. Today's vehicles are a lot different than they were a decade ago, even 5 years ago. These are rocket ships. These are computers that you drive. And to fix these vehicles takes a very different set of tools and equipment and training to do. And so we're seeing to fix today's vehicles, there's a real investment required. And it's an exciting time because these tools are going to add to productivity, add to what you can repair safely and properly. But it's also, I feel for the folks who don't really have the runway to recognize that ROI, where you're not going to hold the business long enough for that to be a payback. And for folks in that situation, I think you probably want to consider exiting the business sooner rather than later if you don't see the runway of making those investments to fix vehicles appropriately.
Yeah. And I think another segue here would be then when you think about calibration, right? You're seeing a lot of decisions that shops are making. Do we want to do this in-house? Do we want to have a partner? What does that look like? Can you just talk about in-house versus out-of-house? If you're looking to grow, is that something you should consider buying and bringing in-house, or should you just develop it yourself? Maybe you could talk about what you're seeing in the market there.
Yeah, it's kind of a polarizing topic, interestingly enough. Is sublet going to win out? Are shops going to really benefit by taking it in-house? And I think it's a question of runway and it's a question of square footage. ADAS calibration today takes a whole lot of space to do properly. And
And
oftentimes,
a unique space, right? You need a
yeah,
long kind of elongated dark tunnel
yeah.
mainly for the European vehicles.
Yeah, and in most cases or many cases, a perfect lighting grid, very
Yes.
scientifically determined, a perfectly level floor within a very, very small amount of leeway. There's a lot that goes into it from an investment perspective, but also an opportunity cost perspective. What could I do with that space, sticking to the core business? To have a vendor to do it, there's a liability component where all right, hey, we have a certified professional taking care of this from us. What I would say, if you have the space and the ability to make those investments in training and equipment, it's a great business. The margins are really nice. I would venture to say most shops don't have the space, and to go ahead and sublet that out to a reliable vendor is a good thing. Scheduling is certainly a component if you're having issues with those vendors and you want to take one more kind of potential hiccup out of the equation, one more thing under your umbrella. It's another point to bringing it back in-house. The calculus there is really different for each operator. However, it's a great component of a business and the margins are really nice.
Yeah, I think once you have a footprint too, and you can feed a lot of your own business, having it as a leg, can be attractive. Whereas if you have one shop, do you even have the demand to require that space, right? Because it is a unique commitment and unique team. You need a staff that is specially trained in that is, has full work, right? And do you want to
Yeah.
worry about making sure that they have that work?
It's a great point. Yeah, the volume is really what it comes down to. And I'm tempted to go to a store count, but that's not really accurate. It's more of a
Yeah.
volume and a capacity component there in your decision making. Plenty of good businesses are built where they exclusively are a vendor to body shops doing calibrations. You can't do that if it's in your own body shop. You can't rely on other people's work to come in the door that's not your own work. So it really does come down to, is there a demand to go ahead and make this worth the space and the investment?
Yeah. Um, no, that all makes sense to me. And I think when you think about, if you are kind of a single shop operator and you're looking at your growth opportunities and you're looking at, building something new versus buying something existing, maybe you could talk about the pros and cons of those two approaches.
Yeah, it's a great thing. And there's really three tranches, right? It's brownfielding,
Yep.
greenfielding, and acquiring. And I've been involved at every level with each of those and really dependent on the situation. From an acquisition standpoint, the pros are certainly a very large one is you have a team in place. You have potentially DRPs or dealership relationships in place. You're hitting the ground running rather than building from scratch. However, you're typically paying a premium over greenfielding or brownfielding. Greenfielding requires a unique skill set and a unique runway. Typically, if this is your first expansion store, would recommend brownfielding, i.e., taking an existing building and building it out to meet the needs of you as a body shop. Lots of opportunity to have good values there. You're not typically buying Class A retail, right? You're buying industrial with some sort of exposure there to the customer facing side of the business. But you can certainly typically get one of those up and running cheaper than acquiring. However, it's going to be a longer runway to build that up. It's going to be a challenge in hiring talent. We'll go back to that technician shortage. It's something that certainly small operators and really big operators are facing challenges in addressing. There's a sweet spot in the middle that I think we might address later. As a smaller growing operator, there's a lot of complexities and less sureness, albeit on a budget to go the brownfield route. Would be happy to talk to anybody who's trying to decide between those options. I think they both have their own merits depending on appetite for risk, connections within the market, and how quickly they want to go ahead and see that at full capacity.
Yes, and I think that's always right. When you're building it yourself, the great thing you control is you control the size and the footprint, which is a huge constraint around what a location looks like. How much parking do you have? How much space do you have fixed for cars? How much under roof space do you have? How many bays can you have, right? And then when you're kind of limited to either existing businesses to acquire or real estate that may have been a body shop or auto repair or one that you're going to convert yourself, there's constraints and pros to everyone. But I wanted to kind of use this, I guess, as a segue into the real estate piece of these transactions. Oftentimes these owner operators of single stores or two stores own the real estate. So can you talk about in these transactions and in these kind of both, if we're partnering or selling to a small regional as well as the strategics, what are your options with the real estate if you own it? And what are the options if you're buying kind of a single store on how you think about financing, owning, what your goal should be with real estate?
It's a great question and a great segue. Before we do that, I want to say one more thing on the brownfielding and greenfielding piece. It's an amazing piece of the business to study and be proficient in, because in a worst case, it gives you some leverage. If that right acquisition does not exist or that right acquisition at the right price does not exist, the ability to say, hey, worst case, we go and build our own is a really strong position to be in. So where you're not caught flat-footed and you're not really held hostage by any one acquisition opportunity. To your question, it's
I would also add that an acquirer that where if you've done both, an acquirer will value that the most.
percent. Yep. Having case studies under your belt and recommendations from something you've lived firsthand is an amazing addition to whatever partnership that might look like. To your point on the real estate, 100%. Love it when folks own their own real estate. There were many, many years where that was really where the value was in your collision repair business. As valuations increased, it was a good chunk of the value, but often not the bulk. And that's obviously dependent on geographies and scale. However, owning the real estate gives you some fantastic optionality. It makes transactions smoother one way or another because you don't have an unwieldy landlord that you're negotiating with who view a transaction as an opportunity to increase rent or change terms and throw some wrenches potentially in some deals. The other is obviously value creation. Oftentimes, regional buyers and in some cases of late, national buyers will actually want to go ahead and acquire the real estate along with the business. However, in the vast majority of cases, existing consolidators and private equity groups would prefer to lease those properties. In the case of selling to a consolidator and exiting your business entirely, that is often the best route to go. Because there's immediate value if structured correctly in having a long-term lease with a national credit tenant, where your property is no longer sold at a value based on an appraisal or comps within the market. It's sold based on a cap rate and based on the lease over that time. So it's sold as an investment rather than a user-owned building. And typically, again, if structured correctly and assuming the market remains kind of where it is today or better, that's likely to add value in that property. So the property, after you lease it for a 10-year plus triple net or mostly triple net lease, is going to add value immediately on top of that dirt and building value itself.
I've also seen some interesting scenarios where owners will, that roll equity will oftentimes ask for first right of refusal on real estate in other transactions that they might do in the future.
Absolutely. Yep. Become a developer, right? Essentially is what that
Yeah.
allows you to do. And it's an amazing opportunity. To that point, when I have clients who are selling to smaller groups or private equity groups, there is a temptation to want to sell using the appraised value because you're kind of gambling on that buyer. Small, non national credit tenants are not close to that level. You're often not going to get a premium cap rate. And therefore, you might end up having a property that's worth less tied up in a lease with somebody who's not of really strong credit. So, really dependent ultimately on the buyer, ultimately on the lease, and ultimately what your right buyer would prefer and is willing to do. Because at the end of the day, specifically when you're partnering with somebody, it's a marriage, and you want to make sure that the partnership is right, not always about that top dollar line.
Agreed. And if you're a small operator looking at buying another small operator, maybe you could talk about the real estate in that scenario and how that might change depending on what your goals are.
Yeah, it ultimately, my view is the bulk of body shops out there are going to land with a national consolidator one day.
Yes.
And so, with that in mind, there's always this component of you want to value your real estate in the back of your mind, if not today, at a cap rate and do an ROI on, hey, all right, if I sold this at appraised value of X, what do I do with that money? Do I have 1031 exchange opportunities? What do I have? Personally, I love the idea of shops acquiring real estate, small operators buying other small operators. I think everybody wins if that real estate is acquired with the transaction, albeit in a separate business entity. And more often than not, that's going to be the case. As a seller to a small operator, there's very little value in having a long term lease with a small operator.
Yes. Yeah. And then, on that note, I think a great kind of transition from there. When you think about the the red flags that can kill deals in collision, right? What are the things that you often see, blow up deals that are avoidable? Not things like, disconnect on pricing or things like that, but what are the kind of avoidable things that maybe are institutionally in a business that can be fixed?
Yeah, employees, 1099s with statuses that are a little bit less than upfront are something that we see in certain markets. Not necessarily a deal destroyer by any stretch, but something that adds some complexity. All your eggs in one or two baskets from a DRP standpoint, I think I mentioned earlier, that's definitely a significant one. And aging technician base. At the end of the day, someone stroking a check for your business is not doing it in all likelihood for the name or for reputation. That's part of it, but they're doing it for the team. And it's the team that ends up creating revenue and creating EBITDA that's going to matter. So you want to make sure that you do have a team that's going to be sticking around for the long haul. Unfortunately, there's oftentimes you see sellers make promises to their team that they don't intend on following through with, but they unknowingly to the buyer expect the buyer to follow through with. You want to make sure you don't leave any grenades left over at the time of a transaction or after. And the last thing, typically one of the biggest challenges in a deal is when the owner does not own the real estate and the landlord creates challenges. So from our perspective, if that is the case, we like addressing that as early as possible and go ahead and start on that process, essentially along with diligence or somewhere within that process to make sure that's not something at the finish line that derails a deal.
Yeah, and then on the technician side, maybe you could talk about, and this is, I guess a wider kind of conversation around OEM certifications versus DRP, but are there things that you should do that help your technician group seem more valuable besides just age, right? What can you do around, your team to kind of maximize the value that you can get on exit from that?
Yeah, I think it's certainly a quantity standpoint. Certifications absolutely are going to add value. If nothing else, it speaks to the quality of the technician that, hey, this is a formal training. ICAR certification, again, is another one that makes a ton of sense to have, not only for your shop, but for the bulk of your team. Beyond that, it really boils down to culture. If you have a strong culture, no cancers in there that are kind of turning the apple cart in a direction we don't want to go. In a perfect world, you really want to address employee and personnel issues before you hand that over to the future steward of your business.
Yeah. And when you're a small operator, potentially buying another small operator, can you just talk about what that integration of teams can look like? What are some of the difficulties there? When you're doing your first kind of integration, or you're doing your first acquisition, or the merger, what are the things that make that work the best for the company and the team?
Yeah, I mentioned it earlier, but there's a sweet spot from a personnel perspective in this industry where they have an easier time retaining and attracting talent. And that's that regional MSO, that 3, 4, up to 20 or so stores where, hey, all right, we're starting to see some upside and career trajectory and the ability to move up within what looks to be a growing organization. But we're also doing work the right way. We're not in a factory type environment. We know the CEO and they know our name. There's a real sweet spot in being able to do that. So scale in and of itself is going to be a positive because in theory, it allows you to get your benefits to a point where you're beginning to compete with the big boys. You have the runway and the ability and the headcount and the revenue and hopefully the bottom line to be able to do that. Fortunately, integrations between one store buying another store or two stores buying another store, there's not a ton going on because you don't have that overlap from a regional management standpoint or in all likelihood, a back office function standpoint. These are operations that are separate. And so in theory, only positives should come from that joining of forces. To keep in mind, though, there are a lot of speed bumps I think that first time acquirers can hit in terms of transferring over DRP relationships and making those announcements in the right way. But you're able to attract more talent. You're able to retain more talent. I think overall, that's a very positive conversation and an exciting time for the teams.
Yeah, and I think when you're a single store and you have DRP relationships, and you're looking at acquiring another single store that does not, or even if you're a small regional MSO that has those, and you're looking at acquiring a store that does not, it's easy to look at it and say, oh, our relationships will apply. Can you talk about what is the best way to actually transfer and then grow? Because DRPs prefer scale as well, right? So how can you
100%.
leverage growth and that story to kind of improve that position and make sure that it does transfer from one to the next?
That is a great question. That's a bit of a moving target for an answer. 2 years ago, even a year ago, it would have been a very different answer than it is today. Insurance companies do like scale. They do like that. They like regional scale too. It's a challenging time. Even the big boys right now are finding it a challenge to turn on DRPs to new stores, just with how kind of some of the industry headwinds and tailwinds are functioning. There is a supply and demand issue between DRPs and body shops where it's actually fascinating. You look at pre-COVID, there was kind of a balance there. COVID comes along, backlogs for shops were 2 months long. People were kicking their DRPs to the side saying, I don't need you. Now we've sort of surpassed that to where there might be a bit of a negative backlog. And as folks are looking to turn DRPs back on, they're being more selective on who they're doing that for. They have more shops reaching out to have a DRP type relationship than they have the need to turn them on. So some challenges there for sure. However, to be a one store trying to get those relationships put in place is going to be a lot more challenging than to be a 5, 6, 7 store operator trying to add one store for additional DRPs. So there does remain some real advantage to scale.
And what do you think you can position yourself to do to get those? I think that at the end of the day, they want to work with partners that, respond to them in a timely manner, that deliver the kind of great service. So how can you communicate that to them? Is it testimonials, reviews? Is it making sure that, you're communicating in a certain way? Are there any kind of tips and tricks you think to helping there?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'd love to send a podcast episode we had, and I'm
Yeah.
sure we'll talk a little bit about the collision vision with a group called GNC out of California. They're the largest kind of family-owned collision repair group in the country, and they've built that largely via some really great DRP relationships. And so Sean Croza is the gentleman we had on, along with an insurer in our series about DRPs. He gave some great tips on that. It is communication. It is being there. It is trying to kind of eat the frog, do the stuff that others really don't want to do. It's a relationship game, right? These
Yeah.
businesses are people businesses. It's people working with people. OEM certifications are not a bad thing. ICAR certification, really a good thing. Just fundamentals and making sure you're highlighting those fundamentals. Had not heard the testimonial piece. I love that idea. Sort of viewing yourself as marketing to insurance companies is going to be a differentiated approach that I think would very likely have some success.
And I think marketing is one of the things where at a small scale, it's difficult to invest in, but there's a lot of things that you can do, even as an individual, meaningfully, that help you on the acquisition side, right? I think even if maybe your brand is the one to live on, maybe it's not, depending on the acquisition scenario. But having a strong brand helps with DRP. It helps retain customer information, and it helps recruit non-DRP, right, as well. And so I think one of the pieces of advice I always give to small and single store episode owners, if you have the resources, try and find a way to invest in marketing, because even if it's not directly proving the ROI now, which it should if you're doing it right, there's a lot of ROI to be gained on exit as well.
Could not agree more. Could not agree more. And it's something I've been shouting from the rooftops around COVID when folks had that 2-month backlog. They said, why the heck would we invest in marketing, man? We can't even deal with the opportunities we have ahead. And the answer at that time was, this is not going to last forever. Take advantage while the market is hot, but keep building that brand, keep building that reputation, because there's no negative side effects. There are only positive ones. And that's from an acquisition front, from a DRP front. In fact, you're probably the guy to talk to about how the heck should we individual shop owners be marketing to DRPs. I think you'd have some better insights than I.
I'm a great idea guy. Sometimes they say, my wife might not say that, but
right there with you.
I think it's one of the things that really you benefit from scale is, right, you increase the capacity to focus on things outside of the core business. And one of the great things about collision in many ways, that if you were just great at being a great provider of fixing cars and providing a great customer experience, that took you really far. There's some businesses where without great sales, without great marketing, without, those things, your ceiling is much lower. But collision has always been an industry where if you give great service to the client, that is the real, especially at the smaller scale, that is by far the most important driver of growth.
100%, man. And it's really, the have to have of everything we're talking about. A lot of these are nice to haves. The have to have is, we're dealing with life and death situations, literally. I mean, we're dealing with flying pieces of metal that, if you do something wrong, people die. And that's number one. And if you're not in a position to do that right now, to very, very confidently fix vehicles in the right way, it's likely time to move on to something else. If you are in position to do that and to make the investments and ensuring you're repairing cars the right way with the right equipment, the right training, the sky's the limit. The expansion opportunities are tremendous, and the opportunities to make a lot of money are right in front of you.
Yeah. And I think another area that you can really benefit from scale and collision is kind of vendor relationships and procurement. Maybe you could talk a little bit about, just as you grow, your life cycle of kind of those vendor relationships and procurement, and how you should think about best positioning yourself in those.
100%. Scale is a superpower when it comes to buying and procurement and the vendor relationships. The bigger you are, almost without fail, the better deal you're going to get. I can guarantee you the Calibers and the Gerbers of the world are buying equipment a lot cheaper than you are. And that's a sliding scale, right? If you're a regional, you're going to get a better paint discount than a single store. And if you're a national, you're going to get a better deal than those regionals are getting. And so it's an amazing addition. We talk about the benefits of scale, including the multiple arbitrage, the multiple expansion, the cost-cutting ability to really centralize your procurement function and ensure you're getting the best deals possible on a lot of these expensive outlays is a really nice positive side effect of scale. But don't forget it either. I mean, as soon as you have store number 2, you're in a position to revisit some of those relationships. And in fact, your paint company, depending on who it is, depending on who you are, depending on your relationship with them, they're incentivized for you to grow. And they are very likely to help you in pursuing that endeavor.
I think that there's an idea too of, right, what's your vision? Sell your vision to vendors, because if you're going, look, I just did this one acquisition and I need to do 3 more, and I need to get there with vendors that want to help me do that. Is that you? People want to be inspired. They want to work with people that are going to grow. And I think you can really use a story to position yourself with vendors. I used to own a hot dog restaurant, actually, and my partner was an unbelievable procurement guy. And he'd always, when we were negotiating because we had these custom made hot dogs and we were trying to figure out who was going to make them. And he was always like, it's not about how many hot dogs we're selling today. It's about how many we're going to sell a year from now. And I think when you are having those conversations, right, it's how can you get them excited for the amount that they're going to sell you in the future? Because that's really what they care about. What does this mean for that salesperson and their quota? right? How can you help them achieve their job?
Could not agree more, man. And it's the story, your story is your superpower, right? Whether that's M&A, I always talk about the story being the most important part. Finance is a very secondary component of mergers and acquisitions. The same is true with your
I
vendors.
couldn't believe that when like really learned about the industry, the narrative is what drives everything.
100%, man. And knowing your story, ensuring it's compelling, ensuring you believe it, and sharing that with your network, whether it's a potential buyer, a potential seller, a potential partner, a vendor, doesn't matter. Your story is what's going to drive things ahead and build those relationships and get people excited for the opportunity to work with you.
Yeah. I I couldn't agree more. I think when you talk about just where the industry is going, right? We've talked about, yes, this consolidation is happening and has happened, but it's changing. We have electric vehicles, we have the growth of calibration, we have all these things happening. Would love to just get your insights into, where you think the industry is going and how owners can start thinking about future proofing their business, right? How can they make sure they're rising with the tides, not being sunk with them?
This is my favorite topic to talk about ever. I mean, it's an amazing thing because you're absolutely right. The industry is changing at such a rapid pace. And a lot of people, potentially rightfully so, are viewing some of these changes as potential headwinds. But in reality, you just shift the sails and you can turn headwinds into some really compelling tailwinds. So, technology, when I first joined the industry, it was 2016, and ADAS was really first coming out, and it was in its early innings and collision avoidance. And the industry was really negative. It was really like, man, this is going to kill our industry. Self-driving is right around the corner. And we had a lot of chicken littles who were really negative. As that technology was rolled out and we realized, all right, hey, this isn't stopping anything. It's really increasing complexity and creating more opportunity for folks, in theory, decreasing total losses to an extent, could go either way. But now, after a decade plus of screaming kind of the world is ending, Chicken Little, we're actually starting to see the impact of these technologies coming to fruition. Have you ever ridden in a Waymo?
Yeah. So I don't know. I used to own I was ran and then merged with a kind of a transportation technology startup where we did a lot of like fleet management software. We owned, 300 vehicles at one point where we would do like scheduled rides. So I was very involved in like the Columbus smart city. I actually spoke to Congress on like the future of kind of technology and transportation and stuff like that. So I'm very familiar with it all.
Very cool. I rode in my first Waymo, I don't know, a month or two ago, and it blew my mind. I had heard about it. I know Tesla's full self-driving technology is amazing as well. Like, it's here. The future is here. I've been giving, really for the last year and a half, coming up on 2 years, a presentation or a speech called The End of the Era of the Single Store Generalist Body Shop, which is a mouthful, but I had to be specific here because it sounds scary. It sounds negative, and it's not. It shows, and the goal of the conversation is to show the path forward toward prosperity to account for all of these changes and opportunities that are going to be created in the future of this industry. And in that presentation, I talk about how single stores today have three viable paths forward, or a combination of these three paths. And that was specialize, scale, and sell. And so I believe the future of not only what body shops do, what I do, what private equity does, the future is specialty.
Yes.
And certainly in collision repair, we are not going to be all things to all people. You are not going to make a great living as one store fixing every car coming in as a generality in the future of collision repair. So, what are you really good at? What's in your market? What's prevalent there? What is your facility equipped to do really, really well? And that can be as specific as exotic, luxury, EV, fleet, or it could be a lot less specific, domestic, not domestic. I don't know. You don't have to get too specific depending on your
Yep.
market. But what are you really good at? How can you drive more money to the bottom line? Shops that specialize in a limited subset of vehicles, I've found are 50% on average more profitable than their generalist counterparts.
They're also more valuable, especially when they become a leg in a larger pool of skill sets.
Absolutely, 100%. And it used to be that specialty a decade ago was really problematic because there wasn't a buyer out there who knew what to do with
Yes.
that. That's changed as we've evolved. The quality collision groups of the world have come to fruition, and you have now numerous folks who see the value in that level of specialization. In fact, the best body shop operation I've ever seen is a single store who specializes, and they've now been able to scale a little bit, but it's amazing. The specialization I am so bullish on for the future of that business. And there's a number of specializations that I really like that I'd be happy to
Can you
dive into
expand
deeper
on those?
detail. Yeah, Highline and exotic is number one. Challenging to fix, challenging to get certifications on, but the moat is significant and the margin opportunity for those types of vehicles are substantial. I really like truck. Spoke with a PPG 20 group in the truck and fleet space. Love that area of specialization. Similarly, margin expansion's fantastic. More of a B2B type effort. Both of these are not at least solely reliant on DRPs. You sort of take your own future into your own hands by being the group or the shop or the guy, focused on those subsectors. EVs, another one where you see a lot of specialty EV shops doing an amazing job fixing vehicles that generalists are typically not super thrilled to see pull into their lot.
And I think EVs are an important one because look, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And you want to be there for that, right? Like you don't want to
Absolutely.
miss that larger percentage of the market. And I think a great way to think about specialization is that doesn't have to be the only thing that you do, right? Like you can be a great truck repair specialist and also have another specialty. Maybe it's at the same
Sure.
location, maybe it's a different location, right? I don't want to say like that when you specialize in something, it has to be the only thing that you do.
Yeah, the best entrepreneurs have a unique ability and vision to be able to spot gaps in their individual markets, right? There's not a one size fits all, but there are opportunities. And if you're the right person or group to take advantage of those entrepreneurs are very successful in making that happen. Big fan of specialization. The other one was scale. In this presentation, it's typically about an hour long. I run through the different accesses to capital. I talk about what makes a shop or a body shop group attractive to private equity. I talk about private debt markets, SBA, all sorts of things. And I mentioned it earlier in our conversation today, but plenty of reasons not to scale. If it's not your skill set, you don't have the right foundation to build upon, you don't have the right team to scale. Those are all very valid. Access to capital should not be a reason to not scale. And then the last one is sell, right? It remains a very active market out there, albeit at different levels with different players depending on the geography than maybe a year or two ago.
Well, I think that's an important note. Something that we didn't cover is to sell in a way. In a way we have, but we haven't really. And I think when people hear to sell, it's almost binary. I keep it or I sell it, right? But it's not at all like that. There's a lot of in betweens. So when you're talking about selling a body shop or selling a group of body shops, can you talk about the different structures, the different tools that can be used in this? If you're going to continue working with the company, what are the ways that you can be rewarded, or what are the ways that you should think about optimizing the different or pulling the different levers to optimize for yourself?
Man, so many different flavors of acquirers and types of acquisition out here that we probably would need the entirety of the conversation to really do this topic justice. But for groups, that buyer pool is often north of 100 to 150 buyers, inclusive of private equity groups and strategics. The valuation gaps at that
Well,
point.
what threshold, because a three location group is very different than a seven. What threshold do you think you need to hit in terms of rooftops or finance thresholds to really active up the full pool of private equity buyers?
Yeah, rooftops, I would have said 5+. However, I've seen some amazing, really big businesses running out of 3 stores. So I'd say 3+ stores from a rooftop perspective establishes your scalability. It's established you're not a one-trick pony. You yourself are not a great on-site manager that's taking this business. No, you have an organization that is scaled and it's shown proof of concept. From a numbers perspective, I think that minimum has decreased just with a supply and demand issue of a lot more groups looking to get in than good platform level opportunities. I'd say you need to be at 2 million plus of EBITDA, give or take, to be considered a true platform. And in that case, as a platform, it's often an expectation, certainly a preference to have the leadership team continue on in a leadership capacity, often rolling equity. With private equity groups, again, many different flavors. I would anticipate as a platform the opportunity to roll somewhere between 20 and 40% being the preference where you're going to find that sweet spot in valuation in terms of, all right, the management team is bought in. they're ready. They're excited for the future, but we as the investor have the opportunity, obviously, to get the bulk of the upside.
Could you quickly just describe too, when you're rolling equity, what does that look like typically? Are you rolling into the hold co above that it's going to go out acquire MSOs? Are you rolling and keeping equity in yours where you have shared services? I would love to just so people can understand what their options are on rolled equity. And I know it's a very deep topic, but maybe you could give a high level.
Yeah, as a platform, typically you're rolling equity into new co. In the case that it's a stock sale, you just literally roll equity into the business they bought. More often, in the case of an asset transaction, there's a new co created with you as the platform, and you're rolling equity, and which is what you want, right? To take advantage of what is ultimately going to scale. Really deep into the weeds, but with private equity groups, a million different flavors, right? You have
Yep.
folks that are coming in highly, highly levered, where if you're selling to them might be the right opportunity, but you want to keep in mind what that growth looks like before you're either called for additional capital contribution or your shares get diluted. You have other groups very well capitalized that approach it mostly or all equity for the platform and grow up there, and you have some more runway before you have to have that conversation. However, that's kind of the typical mechanics of how we see rollover.
And what other, whether it's earnouts or what other structures are common in deals?
Yeah. Earnouts are common in the case that there is customer concentration or some inherent risk in the business. We don't see a ton of those. Where we might see earnouts is if you have multiple stores and one or two of those stores are new and they haven't seen their full potential, to bridge some valuation gaps, saying, hey, I get you can't maybe pay full pop for what we know this store is going to be, but we're also not going to sell it for what it is today. And so we see earnouts really coming into play in that type of scenario, even as non-platforms selling to existing private equity groups who have a platform. We do often see the opportunity to roll over equity into that, albeit your shares might be a decreased class or something of that nature. Typically, like a platform, though, that equity is going to be for the entirety of the platform, not just your stores. We also see seller notes out here to bridge some valuation gaps as well. There's a lot of reasons to like those, assuming you have faith in the future owner of that business.
And on a small scale, when I'm a single store buying another single store, are the levers used the same? Are seller notes more or less prevalent? Are they structured differently?
Going to be more prevalent. So seller financing is a great way to get into the acquisition game. And as single stores right now, it may even allow you to pay a slight premium for those businesses if the business is paying for itself. So we do see that. Typically single store kind of small transactions, we're not seeing a whole lot of conversation around equity roll or continued cooperation, anything along those lines. But seller notes are certainly prevalent. Earnouts, less prevalent, but they do exist.
Yeah. Yeah. So it sounds like you really have a decision maker. If you're a single store and you're just looking to exit, it's probably going to be 100%. But if you're a single store looking to buy another single store, you have, these seller notes and these other kind of debt and other financing options. But if if your goal is to build to kind of a regional MSO, then you want to exit and find a financial partner to continue to grow, maybe 20 to 40% rollover into the holdco, with the goal being that we're going to partner with an investor that is also going to add value to us. And we're going to go out and grow this in a way where my equity is going to trade at a much higher multiple than we started at in 3 to 5 or 7 or 10 years, depending on their strategy.
Yeah, you want that second bite to be more than that first bite, even though you have a smaller piece of the collective pie. The pie's gotten bigger. And I think that's a good point. I go back to my 3 paths forward for single stores of specialize, scale, and sell. Private equity is kind of that middle ground, right? Where you're both scaling and selling. You're taking chips off the table, but more and more, especially I tend to talk about younger entrepreneurs and business owners when I talk about this, but that's not ultimately fair. But operators who have runway here, they are talking about private equity less like they're selling and more like they are partnering to provide some rocket fuel for what they have going on, to double down on growth, to say, hey, I would rather own 30% of a watermelon than 100% of a grape. And we're seeing more and more of those transactions happening, again, trending toward younger business owners.
Yeah, got it. Well, on that note, I think it's been a really fantastic conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time. Is there anything you think that would be, you want to end on, or you feel like you've covered it pretty well?
Yeah, I'll give two plugs for some resources for the collision repair industry. The first, we launched a valuation tool, free valuation tool at focusbankers.com. We're aiming to be sort of an unbiased resource for the industry there. Whether you're buying, whether you're selling, whether you're just wanting to check on put a finger on the pulse of the market, we want to put that tool out there to help people make sure, hey,
Sourceco has a similar one, so you can
let's
compare.
go.
You can.
Absolutely. Whatever it is, man, I love it. But the ultimate goal, I think, for both of us is to ensure business owners who have spent a lot of blood, sweat, and tears building something that when it comes time to exit, they're educated on what they are worth.
Yes.
And I think
Yep.
that's very important, regardless of which route they
And what
go.
their options are.
Education. Exactly right. Exactly right. Secondarily, I host a podcast called The Collision Vision, driven by Auto Body News. It's 3 years old now, so we've posted new episodes every single week coming up on 3 years. It's not me sitting here talking like I did today. You've been a wonderful host and given me the opportunity to do so. I try to do the same. We have amazing guests, collision repair specific guests, focused on the business side of the collision repair industry. So you can check that out at autobodynews.com, on YouTube. It's The Collision Vision, or wherever you get your podcasts.
It's funny. I've heard though that the host of that is nowhere near as good looking as the host of Sourceco's podcast.
You know what? That's what people are saying, and I don't love it.
Well, no, like I appreciate it, and we look forward to continuing to collaborate, continuing to grow, and be resourceful to each other. So, thank you.
Hey, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for all you do, and appreciate your friendship.
Yeah. All right. Bye, bye, Cole.